While Americans fought Germans in the Battle of the Bulge, German soldiers in Kansas were celebrating Christmas with American farm families, singing Silent Night together around a barn table. This is the story of 370,000 enemy soldiers who discovered America from the inside, and why hundreds never wanted to leave. September 14, 1944, a dirt road outside Concordia, Kansas. Population 6,847. The convoy of olive-drab trucks kicked up clouds of dust as it rolled past endless fields of wheat stubble baking under the late summer sun. In the back of the lead truck, 23 German soldiers sat in silence, their field-gray uniforms faded and patched, watching America pass by through the canvas flaps. They had surrendered to American forces in Normandy just 11 weeks earlier. Most expected to spend the war behind barbed wire, counting days until they could return to whatever remained of the Reich. None of them expected to end up on a Kansas farm, sitting down to dinner with an American family. Gefreiter Hans Goertz pressed his face closer to the opening, staring at what looked like a mirage. Farmhouses, dozens of them, each standing alone in vast acreage painted white or red with barns larger than anything he'd seen in his village near Münster, tractors gleaming in farmyards, automobiles, multiple automobiles parked beside homes, children playing in yards waving at the convoy as it passed. "Das kann nicht sein," he whispered to the man beside him. This cannot be. But it was. By September 1944, the United States faced an agricultural crisis of catastrophic proportions. With over 12 million American men in uniform and another 18 million working in war industries, the nation's farms were hemorrhaging labor. The 1944 harvest season threatened to see millions of tons of crops rot in fields from Washington to Georgia. Wheat, cotton, sugar beets, potatoes, corn, the very food that fed not just America, but Allied armies across 2 oceans, stood at risk. The solution was as pragmatic as it was surreal. Deploy German prisoners of war. Between 1943 and 1946, approximately 425,000 Axis POWs were held in camps across the United States, 371,683 of them German. While much has been written about the main camps, far less is known about the extraordinary labor detachment program that sent tens of thousands of these prisoners into the American heartland, where they lived and worked alongside the very people whose sons and brothers they had been fighting weeks or months before. This is the story of what happened when Hitler's soldiers discovered small-town America, and why hundreds never wanted to leave. The journey typically began in North Africa or Europe. After capture by American forces, German POWs were processed through temporary camps, then loaded onto Liberty ships for the Atlantic crossing. Unlike their U-boat counterparts, who had hunted these same waters, they traveled safely, if not comfortably, in the holds of cargo vessels. Unteroffizier Werner Burkhardt, captured at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia in February 1943, later described his first glimpse of America in a letter preserved at the National Archives. "We docked at Norfolk on March 18th. I had prepared myself for a land destroyed by war, rationed and desperate like our own. Instead, the harbor was a forest of cranes and ships, mountains of supplies, soldiers who looked well-fed, even fat, and the guards who processed us offered cigarettes, American cigarettes, as if they cost nothing. The cigarettes were a small detail, but German POWs mentioned them repeatedly in letters and post-war interviews. In a Germany where tobacco had become a currency more valuable than Reichsmarks, American guards casually distributed Lucky Strikes and Camels. It was the first hint that these men had entered a different economic reality entirely. From the ports, prisoners were distributed to over 500 base camps and 700 branch camps across 46 states. The largest camps were in the South and Southwest. Texas alone hosted 78 camps, holding over 50,000 POWs. But the agricultural labor program eventually spread prisoners across the Midwest and Plains states, Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, Wisconsin, Minnesota, the Dakotas, Camp Concordia in Kansas, where Hans Goertz arrived that September day in 1944, was typical of medium-sized facilities. Established in October 1943 on 280 acres of former farmland, it held approximately 4,000 German POWs at its peak. The compound consisted of tar paper barracks, mess halls, a canteen, recreation facilities, and a hospital. all surrounded by a single barbed wire fence with guard towers at the corners. Security, veterans later admitted, was remarkably lax. Where would they escape to? Recalled James Henderson, who served as a guard at Concordia in 1944-45, in a 1989 oral history interview. "We were in the middle of Kansas. Nearest city of any size was Manhattan, over 100 miles away. Most of these guys were farm boys themselves. From Bavaria, Saxony, the Rhineland, they looked at all that open farmland and saw, well, they saw home. Or at least what home used to be before the war. The Geneva Convention of 1929 stipulated that POWs could be employed in non-military labor, provided they were paid, adequately fed, and worked in reasonable conditions. The United States, anxious to maintain the same protections for American POWs held in Germany, scrupulously followed these rules, and then some. The German POWs earned 80 cents per day for their labor, paid in canteen coupons that could purchase toiletries, candy, beer, and other items. They worked 8-hour days, 6 days a week. They received the same rations as American soldiers, 4,000 calories daily, including meat at every meal. Their camps featured soccer fields, theater groups, educational classes, and camp newspapers. Some camps had swimming pools and tennis courts. The contrast with conditions in Germany, especially by late CO. 1944 was staggering. "My brother was fighting on the Eastern Front," Hans Goertz wrote in a letter intercepted by camp censors in November 1944. His last letter from August spoke of eating grass soup and the leather from boots. Mother writes that the ration in Münster is now 1,600 calories, mostly turnips and black bread. "Here I eat bacon and eggs for breakfast. White bread with butter. Yesterday we had beefsteak. I have gained 8 kilograms in 2 months. Sometimes I am ashamed. But the real transformation began when the prisoners left the camps for the farms. October 3rd, 1944. The Hoffman farm, 12 miles east of Concordia. Robert Hoffman watched the truck pull into his farmyard with mixed feelings. His son, Robert Jr., was with the 1st Infantry Division somewhere in Belgium, according to his last letter. And now the War Department was sending him Germans to help bring in his sugar beet crop. The irony wasn't lost on him. 6 prisoners climbed down from the truck, accompanied by a single American guard, a kid who looked maybe 19, holding his rifle like it was a broom handle. The prisoners lined up, and the guard, consulting a clipboard, read out names with painful pronunciation. Goertz, Hans, Müller, Friedrich, Zimmermann, Otto. Robert Hoffman was 58 years old, 4th-generation Kansas farmer, built like a water tower and just as sturdy. He'd learned some German from his own grandparents, who'd immigrated from Hesse in the 1870s. He stepped forward and, in rough but intelligible German, said, "Welcome. You're here to work. Work hard, we'll get along fine. Anybody here know sugar beets?" 3 hands went up. The farm labor program operated under strict regulations on paper. POWs were to be supervised at all times, kept separate from civilians, returned to camps each evening. No fraternization, no entering farm homes, no sharing meals with American families. In practice, these rules dissolved almost immediately. How are you going to supervise 6 men working a 100-acre beet field? Robert Hoffman's daughter, Martha Hoffman Klein, recalled in a 2003 interview for the Cloud County Historical Society, "Dad had 1 guard, and the guard was usually a boy who'd been 4F or who'd just gotten back from overseas wounded. After the first week, the guard would just park himself under a tree with a sandwich and a magazine while the Germans worked. Everybody knew the rules were nonsense. Sugar beet harvesting was backbreaking work. The beets had to be pulled, topped, and loaded into wagons, all by hand. It required skill, stamina, and speed. The Hoffman farm had 180 acres of beets that October, and Robert had worried he'd lose half the crop. He'd lost his hired hands to the draft and war industries. His wife Elizabeth helped when she could. His daughter Martha, 17, worked alongside him, but it wasn't enough. The German POWs changed everything. Those boys worked like demons, Martha remembered, especially Hans Goertz. He'd grown up on a farm in Westphalia. He knew beets, knew wheat, knew livestock. By the 3rd day, Dad was consulting with Hans about which fields to harvest first, asking his opinion about the weather. My mother nearly had a fit the first time Dad invited them onto the porch for water. Then one day it rained, and they all came into the kitchen, October 11th, 1944. That was the day the Hoffmans shared their first meal with German soldiers. Elizabeth Hoffman had made chicken and dumplings, Depression-era comfort food, cheap and filling. When the skies opened up that afternoon, the men were soaked and shivering. Robert made a decision. He brought them into the mudroom, gave them towels, and told his wife to set 6 more places. The prisoners sat at the kitchen table, stunned into silence. The guard, a kid from Topeka named Eddie Reese, shrugged and sat down too. They didn't talk much at first, Martha recalled. Just stared at the food. When Mother brought out the chicken, a whole chicken roasted plus dumplings, green beans from the garden, biscuits, butter, coffee, apple pie. One of them actually had tears in his eyes. Hans told us later that it was the first time he'd sat at a family table in 3 years, that it reminded him of home before the war, before everything went crazy. This scene, or variations of it, played out across thousands of American farms between 1943 and 1946. In Nebraska, Farmer John Krasick wrote to the War Department in November 1944, praising his POW workers. "These men are diligent, skilled, and respectful. They have saved my corn crop. I would hire them permanently if allowed." In Wisconsin, dairy farmer Helen Mueller requested the same crew of German POWs return for 3 consecutive seasons. In Texas, cotton farmers pooled resources to throw Christmas parties for their POW workers. The transformation worked both ways. For the farmers, desperate for labor, the prisoners became essential partners. For the prisoners, American farm life offered something they hadn't experienced in years: normalcy. Friedrich Müller, who worked on the Hoffman farm alongside Hans Goetz, kept a diary throughout his captivity, later donated to the Eisenhower Presidential Library. His entry from October 22, 1944 reads, "Today I milked cows for the first time since leaving my father's farm in 1939 to join the Wehrmacht. The Hoffman dairy has 40 head, more than any farm in my village. The barn has electric lights, a radio playing music, machines for everything. After evening milking, Mr. Hoffman showed me his tractor, a 1938 John Deere Model B. I sat in the seat and he explained the controls. For a moment I forgot I was a prisoner. I forgot there was a war. I was simply a farmer again, talking with another farmer about soil and weather and the hope of good harvest." The POW labor program expanded dramatically through late 1944 and 1945. By war's end, German POWs had harvested crops in virtually every agricultural region of the United States. They picked cotton in Texas, Arizona, and Arkansas, over 23 million pounds in Texas alone during 1944. They harvested potatoes in Idaho and Maine. They cut timber in Minnesota and Oregon, approximately 140 million board feet processed by POW labor. They worked in canneries, sugar refineries, and food processing plants. The economic impact was profound. A 1946 war. Department report calculated that POW labor contributed approximately $230 million to the American agricultural economy, roughly $3.6 billion in 2024 dollars. In some states, POWs constituted over 10% of agricultural workers during peak seasons. Without them, military historians estimate, American food production would have declined by 15 to 20% in 1944-1945, potentially affecting military operations overseas, but the numbers tell only part of the story. The real transformation was cultural and psychological. Camp Concordia, like many POW camps, developed an elaborate internal society. Prisoners organized classes in English, history, mathematics, and agriculture. They formed orchestras, theater companies, and sports leagues. The camp newspaper, Der Ruf, the Call, published poems, essays, and news. Educational officers, part of the Army's intellectual diversion program, screened carefully selected films and facilitated discussions about democracy, individual rights, and post-Nazi Germany. But the real re-education happened on the farms. "You can show a man propaganda films about American democracy," explained Dr. Ron Robin, author of the Barbed-Wire College, Reeducating German POWs in the United States during World War II, in a 2015 interview. But when he sits at a farmer's table, eats meals with the family, sees how they treat each other, how they talk about their government, some with respect, some with criticism, all without fear, that's when abstract concepts become reality. These men were living democracy, not studying it. Hans Goetz's letters home, preserved because they were intercepted by German censors and later captured by Allied forces, document his evolving perspective. In September 1944, newly arrived, he wrote, "We are treated correctly according to the Geneva rules. The guards are not brutal." By November, "The Americans have much, but they also work hard. The farmer here rises at 4:30 each morning. His wife manages the household and keeps financial records. They respect labor." By February 1945, "I begin to understand why we lost. It is not only their machines and factories, it is something else. They believe a man can rise through work, can improve his station. Here the farmer's daughter attends university. She will study agriculture and return to manage the farm. This would be impossible in the Reich, where everything is controlled from above. Not every prisoner underwent such transformation. Some remained committed Nazis, viewing their captivity as a temporary setback before eventual German victory. The camps had internal conflicts between die-hard National Socialists and those who'd grown disillusioned with Hitler's regime. There were incidents of violence. At Camp Concordia in November 1944, a suspected anti-Nazi prisoner was beaten by fellow POWs. American authorities increasingly segregated the camps, separating hardcore Nazis from what they termed cooperative prisoners. But for many farm workers, especially those placed with families for extended periods, the ideological grip loosened. December 25, 1944. The Hoffman Farm. The War Department regulations were clear. No celebration of Christmas with POWs. No gifts, no religious services with American civilians. Strictly prohibited. Robert Hoffman ignored them. "It was Christmas," Martha Hoffman Klein recalled. "We'd had these boys working with us for 3 months. Hans had helped Dad fix the tractor when it broke down. Fritz taught me some German songs. Otto carved a wooden horse for my little nephew. They were kids, most of them 20, 22 years old, far from home during Christmas. What were we supposed to do?" The Hoffmans invited the POW work crew to Christmas dinner. They decorated a small tree in the barn. Elizabeth cooked a ham, made her grandmother's stolen recipe, prepared more food than they could possibly eat. Robert carved the ham while Hans led the group in singing Stille Nacht, Silent Night in German. The Americans joined in English. The guard, Eddie Reese, contributed a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving. "It was the strangest, most wonderful Christmas of my life," Martha said. "Here we were, Americans and Germans, sitting together while American boys were dying in the Battle of the Bulge. We knew it was happening. We'd heard it on the radio that morning. But in that moment, in that barn, we were just people, just human beings sharing a meal and remembering that we were all children of God." Similar scenes occurred across the country that Christmas. At Camp Hearn in Texas, local churches provided Christmas packages for POWs. In Wisconsin, the town of Barron invited POWs to a community Christmas service. In Nebraska, farmer families pooled ration coupons to bake cookies for their German workers. The military authorities mostly looked the other way. They had bigger concerns. By late 1944, it was clear Germany would lose the war. The question became what kind of Germany would emerge. The intellectual diversion program intensified, trying to create a cohort of Germans who'd experienced democracy firsthand and might help rebuild a democratic Germany. No one planned it this way, but the farm labor program became the most effective re-education tool America had. May 8, 1945, VE Day. Germany surrendered. For the POWs in America, the news produced complex reactions. Joy that the killing had stopped, relief that they'd survived, anxiety about what they'd find when they returned home, grief for the Germany they knew, now destroyed, and for some a strange reluctance to leave. Hans Goetz heard the news while working in the Hoffman wheat fields. Robert Hoffman came out in his truck, climbed down, and simply said in German, "It's over. Germany surrendered this morning." They stood in silence for several minutes, the wheat rippling around them in the May breeze. "I should feel joy," Hans finally said, "but I feel only sadness. My country is destroyed, my family. I don't know if they survived the bombing. My city is rubble. And here is beautiful." The war's end didn't mean immediate repatriation. Under the Geneva Convention, POWs could be retained for labor, until a formal peace treaty. Labor-starved American agriculture lobbied hard to keep the German workers. Through 1945 and 1946, most POWs remained in the camps, continuing their farm work. This period between Germany's surrender and actual repatriation saw the deepest integration between prisoners and communities. With the war over, restrictions loosened further. POWs attended county fairs, baseball games, and church services. Some farms effectively adopted their workers. The Hoffman family tried to sponsor Hans Goertz for permanent immigration. Dad went to every authority he could find, Martha recalled. He wrote to our congressman, to the War Department, to the State Department. He argued that Hans was a skilled farmer, exactly the kind of immigrant America needed, that he'd proven his character and work ethic, that he wanted to stay, wanted to become American. Hans did want to stay. His letters from this period, no longer censored, are explicit. In June 1945, he wrote to the American Friends Service Committee, one of the organizations helping POWs, "I have nothing to return to in Germany. My father's farm was in the path of the British advance. I do not know if it still stands. Here, Mr. Hoffman has offered to help me bring my mother and sisters to America if they survived. I wish to farm here. I wish to become American. I have seen that a man can be free here, can speak his mind, can build a life through honest work." The application was denied. American immigration law in 1945 maintained strict quotas. Germany was limited to approximately 25,900 immigrants per year, and millions were applying. Former enemy soldiers, regardless of their conduct or character, were lowest priority. Similar applications across the country met the same fate. At least 347 documented requests from POWs seeking to remain in America were filed between May 1945 and June 1946, according to records at the National Archives. Only 19 were approved, mostly in cases where the POW had married an American woman before the war. A handful had been civilian exchange students or workers caught in America when war began. The denials created genuine grief on both sides. July 23, 1946, the final day, the last group of German POWs left Camp Concordia on a hot Tuesday morning. Hans Goertz and Friedrich Müller were among them. Boarding trucks that would take them to Fort Leavenworth, then to ships at New York, then back across the Atlantic to a shattered Germany. The Hoffman family drove into town to say goodbye, against regulations, but the guards no longer cared. Mother packed a food parcel for Hans, Martha remembered. Cookies, dried beef, things that would keep for the journey. Dad gave him $50 in cash, a huge amount in 1946. Hans cried. He tried to refuse it, but Dad pressed it into his hands and said, "You earned every penny. You saved my farm. You're a good man, Hans, don't forget that. Don't let anyone tell you different." Hans Goertz managed to say, "You showed me that not all the world is hate and war. That people can be good, can be kind, even to enemies. I will remember. I will tell my children, if God grants me children. I will tell them about America, about Kansas, about the Hoffmans who treated a German soldier like a human being." They shook hands. Then Robert Hoffman pulled Hans into a hug, a farmhand's embrace, firm and brief but genuine. Elizabeth hugged him too. Martha gave him a photograph of the family standing in front of the barn. Then the trucks rolled out, carrying 4,000 men who'd spent years as enemies, then workers, then something approaching friends. Camp Concordia closed in September 1946. The barracks were sold and moved, becoming homes and farm buildings across the county. The land returned to agriculture. By 1950, few physical traces remained, but the human connections endured. Hans Goertz did make it home. His family farm near Münster had been damaged, but not destroyed. His mother and 2 sisters survived. His father and brother did not. He rebuilt the farm through the late 1940s and 1950s. Married, had 4 children. He corresponded with the Hoffmans for 40 years. The letters, preserved by Martha Hoffman Klein and later donated to the Kansas State Historical Society, document 2 families maintaining connection across an ocean and a former war. Robert Hoffman sent farming magazines and seed catalogs. Hans sent photographs of his rebuilt farm, his growing children. They exchanged Christmas cards every year. In 1963, Hans sent a photograph of his oldest son beginning university studies in agricultural science with the note, "You see, the Hoffman influence extends to the next generation." Hans Gurtz never returned to Kansas, couldn't afford the journey, but he told his children and grandchildren about his time there. When he died in 1989, his obituary in the Münster newspaper mentioned that he'd been a POW in America and considered it the time that saved my soul. He was not alone. Research by German historians has identified at least 1,200 former POWs who maintained correspondence with American families after the war. Many sent their children to study in America. Several hundred eventually immigrated in the 1950s and 1960s. Once immigration restrictions eased, former POWs became some of the strongest voices for German-American friendship during the Cold War and beyond. In 1976, Camp Concordia held a reunion. 7 former POWs made the journey from Germany, including Friedrich Müller. The Concordia newspaper reported that over 400 local residents attended. Farmers, former guards, townspeople who remembered the Germans working in fields and shops. They shared meals, memories, and genuine affection. "It could have been different," Friedrich Müller told the newspaper. "We could have been treated as Nazis, as enemies worthy of hate. Instead, you treated us as men. You shared your tables and your lives. You showed us a better way. We carried that home with us, and it helped us build a better Germany. Your kindness was not weakness, it was the greatest strength." The German POW experience in America reveals a paradox at the heart of warfare, that even in the midst of total war, humanity can persist. While Americans fought Germans across Europe, Americans and Germans worked side by side in Kansas wheat fields, Wisconsin dairy barns, and Texas cotton fields. The official statistics are impressive. 425,000 POWs detained, millions of man-hours of labor contributed, billions of dollars of economic value generated, virtually zero successful escapes, minimal violence, near-perfect compliance with Geneva Convention standards. But the unofficial story, the human story, is more remarkable still. By 1946, the United States had demonstrated that even prisoners of war could be treated with dignity, that security didn't require brutality, that winning hearts and minds was more effective than simple coercion. The farm labor program, born of agricultural necessity, accidentally became an experiment in reconciliation. It helped create a generation of Germans who'd experienced American democracy firsthand and carried that experience into rebuilding post-war Germany. West Germany's emergence as a stable democracy owed much to many factors: the Marshal Plan, the Wirtschaftswunder economic miracle, strong leadership. But historians increasingly recognize the subtle influence of returned POWs who'd spent years in America, who'd seen democracy function at the grassroots level, who'd experienced the dignity of being treated as individuals rather than cogs in a totalitarian machine. They came as enemies, wrote historian Arnold Krammer in Nazi Prisoners of War in America. They left as witnesses to a different way of life. Not all were converted, but enough were transformed that they became agents of change in rebuilding Germany. The farm fields of Kansas, Nebraska, and Texas became unlikely classrooms where practical democracy was taught through example rather than lecture. The last German POW left American soil in July 1946. The camps were dismantled, the barracks sold, the guard towers torn down. Within a decade, few visible traces remained. But in farmhouses across the Midwest, families kept photographs and letters from German boys who'd worked their fields. In villages across Germany, former POWs told stories of abundance and kindness that seemed like fairy tales but were real. And when the two nations, so recently locked in mortal combat, needed to forge alliance against a new threat during the Cold War, thousands of personal connections forged between farmers and prisoners, guards and detainees, families and young men far from home, made that reconciliation easier. September 14, 1944. A dirt road outside Concordia. Kansas, Hans Gurtz watched America pass by through the canvas flaps of a truck, unable to believe what he was seeing. He expected to be a prisoner. Instead, he found himself becoming something else, a student of democracy, a participant in American life, a bridge between two worlds. The war was supposed to make him hate Americans. Instead, it taught him that enemies could become friends, that ideology could bend before shared humanity, that even in darkness light could break through. That lesson, learned in wheat fields and barn lofts, at kitchen tables and country churches, by hundreds of thousands of men on both sides of the barbed wire, remains one of World War II's most quietly revolutionary legacies. Not all prisoners wanted to stay. Not all stories ended hopefully. Wars are terrible, and this one was among the most terrible in history. But for a few years in the American heartland, something remarkable happened. Enemies discovered they were simply men. And that discovery, multiplied across thousands of farms and millions of interactions, helped heal a world torn apart by hate. The German POWs who never wanted to leave didn't all get to stay. But they carried America with them, in memories, in photographs, in values absorbed through lived experience rather than propaganda, and that perhaps was worth more than any military victory.